A number of years ago, Tyco International chairman, a man by the name of Dennis Kozlowski, threw an elaborate birthday party costing over $2 million on the Italian island of Sardinia. Now, this event was staged to celebrate his wife's 40th birthday. It featured gladiators as guards, waiters dressed in togas, imported fig trees, and an ice sculpture of Michelangelo's David. And amazingly, Kozlowski decided to try to charge all of this to his company. It was one in a series of missteps that finally led to his plunge to disgrace, leading many to believe that he, like many CEOs in the corporate culture of America, was vastly overrated and overpaid. Several years ago, CBS Market Watch did a survey. They began to look into sort of these things. They wanted to come up with a list of jobs that people have that are ridiculously rewarding. And interestingly, CEOs were not at the top of this list. That spot, not surprisingly, was occupied by mutual fund managers. They could easily earn $500,000 to $1 million a year, including bonuses, and that's just kind of average pay. Even though only 3 in 10 beat the market once a decade, 3 times in a decade. You know, that's major money for not so great performance. But there were some other interesting professions on there. For example, one of them was wedding photographers. Did you know that wedding photographers make as much as $2,000 per wedding? Then there's airline pilots, bringing as much as $250 a year at Delta for a job that technology has almost fully automated. Now, that's serious salary, yes, but still, we don't want bad photos for our wedding. We can kind of understand that. And let's face it, I'd rather have a highly paid pilot on my jet than some guy that's just learning the ropes. So that's fair enough. But here are a few others that were interesting. West Coast longshoremen, these are the individuals who work on the docks. They earn an average of $112,000 a year for handling cargo. And office clerks who log shipping records into computers who take in $136,000 a year. Or the foremen there who get an average of $177,000. I was just mentioning airline pilots, and of course I was flying a couple weeks ago. Did you know that airport skycaps often make $70,000 to $100,000 a year? Most of it in cash tips. Moving on through Market Watch's top 10, we come to real estate agents selling expensive homes. Not surprisingly here, ex-politicians on the lecture circuit, orthodontists, and over-the-hill athletes still on long-term contracts. They haven't played in years, but they're still getting paid. Anybody remember Bobby Bonilla, the baseball player? He still gets $1 million a year from the New York Mets, and he's getting it every year for, I think, about 10 or 15 more. Not a bad way to make a living. Now, the burden of making too much money is a load that many of us would gladly shoulder, of course. But there are some dangers that go along with this. And today's passage from Luke presents the very real risk that go along with material riches. In the parable told by Jesus, we meet the man who holds the most overpaid job in ancient Palestine. Namely, he is the rich fool. Not that he seems that foolish at first, does he? In fact, at the beginning of the story, he's presented as a good farmer and a shrewd businessman. He's done well. His land has produced abundantly. And with wealth pouring in much faster than he can use it, he faces a problem. What do I do now? What do I do with all of this? I've got so much that I can't even store it. Now, we might think, why don't you give some away? Why don't you do some good with it? Share it with those less fortunate. But instead, he comes up with a different plan. He comes up with a new solution. He decides to pull down his barns and build even bigger ones so that he can store all that he has. Always quick to take charge and give orders, he plans to say to his soul, "Hey, soul, you are doing it all right. Go ahead, relax, eat, drink, and be merry." Did you know the origin of that phrase was biblical? You might not have. But then comes the big surprise. What happens to him? Something happens that the rich man didn't factor into his business plans or enter into his Excel spreadsheet. God says to him, "You fool! This very night your life is being demanded of you. And all the things you have prepared, well, whose will they be?" We don't get a reply. We don't know if the man is speechless. Perhaps he was. He realizes that his status as Palestine's most overpaid landowner doesn't help him at all. In fact, it puts his soul in danger. And he discovers that his efforts on earth have been terribly misdirected. He has been storing up treasures for himself instead of becoming rich toward God. And those big bucks that always felt like a blessing, well, now they feel like a curse. Now, it's easy to take this and run with it and go off on tangents, but what I want to do with this today is take this and make this a little bit more practical for us. Because this is fundamentally a tale about greed, and every single one of us at some time or another struggles with that. It can be greed for a lot of things. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But greed is a virus that can infect any one of us, whether we have money or not. The 10th commandment, after all, is for covetousness, right? That's wanting what your neighbor has. We'll talk about that in a minute. The lesson here is not about the virtues or perils of being successful. There is nothing wrong with being successful. It is instead about a hierarchy of priorities that reveal what type of person we are. And Jesus' advice to us is strong and to the point. Take care. Be on guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. So let's take this apart a little bit. And let me share a few points with you. The first is this. Greed is something we all have to be on guard against. The image Jesus suggests here is that greed sort of lurks or stalks around in our lives. It's a midnight marauder seeking a way to get in and cause mischief in our lives. Greed is a sin that can blow us up in an explosion of meaninglessness. You fool, this night your life is being demanded of you. And the things that you have prepared, whose will they be, God says. And that's why in this passage Jesus says, take care. Take care. Be careful. In other words, take preventative, proactive, preemptive measures to ensure that greed doesn't find space in your soul to occupy. Now, how does this happen? Well, think about how our attitudes toward possessions are shaped and formed. Many people say that we now live in a post-literate culture. Not as many people are reading, and we are bombarded instead with images, and I think that is very true. We get images all the time. And the way we form ideas and values is not now often through reading, but through seeing. We're influenced by what we see on television or in movies or on our phone or online. Ads that we see, not ads that we read. And these ads don't try to make a rational argument in favor of their product. Rather, they show us images that evoke a three-step appeal. First, see this image and feel this need. Has that ever happened to you? You see a picture and say, ooh, I'd like that. Second, buy this and use it. I like that, and I'm going to get that. And third, believe that by using this product, you will be like the people in the images you see, even if they are 19-year-olds frolicking on the beach. I'm not going to get there at this point in my life. But do you see what I mean in advertising today? They get your attention. Look at this. They get you to think, I need this. And then they get you to think, and if I get this, I'll be like that. We have to erect a greed guard. We have to be aware that the seed of greed comes to us in this way. Decisions can then be made about whether or not we actually need it in the first place. Or if instead the potential purpose of an item is simply a response to our greed need. The second thing we can learn is that Jesus refers to all kinds of greeds. In other words, greed is not just greed. It apparently comes in all shapes, sizes, and colors. And the greed appeal will vary from person to person. Your point of vulnerability might be completely different from another person's. The objects of greed are varied and virtually infinite. Again, think of all the ads we see out there. Think of all the things that interest you. What do you struggle with greed? I knew a person one time who was a serial car trader. You know what I mean? About once every 6 months, they were going to trade their car. They'd get a new car. They'd have that new car smell. They'd love their new car. And then they see an advertisement for another one, and that's what I need. But there are many others. There are people who are taking trips that they can't afford. Perhaps it's clothing. Perhaps it's books. Not that I have a problem with that. I've got just as many at home as I've got in my office, too, just so you know. It could be home furnishings. There's one particular company right now that just makes it look so easy. My life's a disaster, but if I order from that company, everything will come together, right? Whatever has our attention, whatever we are interested in, is a gateway to greed. That's where we get into this idea of covetousness in the 10th commandment, right? We get looking at what someone else has, and we think, why does he get to have that? Why does that neighbor get that new car? Why do they get that pool installed? I could have a pool. And it's not that it's wrong to get a new car, and it's not that it's wrong to have a pool, and it's not that it's wrong to have a bunch of books. But what we have to be careful about is that what I care about? And at least a checkpoint, point 3. One's life does not consist in the abundance of stuff, in the abundance of possessions. Here Jesus invites us not to avoid a life of success, but instead to choose a life of significance, a life which is balanced and meaningful. Terry Mattingly, who taught at Palm Beach Atlantic University, argues that we can uncover our priorities by asking 3 simple questions. I'm going to say each of these twice so you will remember them. This is the first one. How do you spend your time? How do you spend your time? The second is this. How do you spend your money? How do you spend your money? And the third is, how do you make your decisions? How do you make your decisions? Again, those are from Terry Mattingly. He suggests that if we examine how we spend our time, how we spend our money, and how we make our decisions, if we think about that and we answer those questions honestly, we will begin to figure out who or what is actually important in our lives. And interestingly, we may find out that it's not who or what we think is important. We begin to find out who or what is really important. Jesus reminds us that life isn't about what we have Instead, it's about who we are. In the end, what we have isn't going to matter that much. Russian author Tolstoy, back to books again, huh? Tolstoy had a short story called How Much Land Does a Man Need? Now, Tolstoy was commenting on the system, the feudal system that was set up at that time in Russia. Russia, even into the 1900s, still had a feudal system, and they had peasants who had to work the land for other people. And a particular Russian peasant was told that he could have all the land he could walk around in the time between sunup and sundown. All he had to do when the sun came up was set out, keep walking in this big circle, and when he got back at sundown, all of it would be his. So with the rising of the sun, the peasant began walking as fast as he could. About mid-morning, it seemed that he was moving too slowly, so he increased his pace and didn't even stop for lunch. And as the afternoon heat beat down on him, he hurried his pace even more, and he felt that he simply must circle more and more land. And by late afternoon, he was soaked with sweat from head to toe. He was exhausted. He had walked around a huge section, but he still yearned for more. So he began to run, and breathlessly he pushed himself into a fatigue he had never known. His heart beat wildly, and as the sundown was only a few minutes away, and he was running faster and faster, and he was running toward his point of beginning, a point that would have made him the largest landholder in the district. He fell down and died. And got nothing. A few less steps, he would have been okay. But greed got the best of him. Jesus' comment to the rich man was this: so it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God. Rich toward God. I like that. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.